Hi, everybody. Good morning. Welcome back. This week we're going to talk about Jews and the state in our never-ending quest to understand early American Jewry. So thus far we talked about the birth of American Jewry in 1654, and last week we talked about sort of what the Jewish community looked like, and we heard a lot of sort of funny / sad stories about how assimilated they were and how difficult it was for their communities to keep control of them. So one of the goals for this class was not only to show how difficult it was for them to perpetuate themselves in early America, but also to show how welcoming the external atmosphere was. So this week we're going to talk about the state and the Jews. Jewish historians often say that they look at Jewish history from three different perspectives: Jewish internal communal life, the Jewish relationship with external society, and the Jewish relationship with the state. So we've sort of talked about the relationship of the internal Jewish community to itself. We will next week talk a lot about how the Jews interacted with Gentile members of society. We've also talked a little bit about that already. So today we're going to talk about the Jews in the state. So we're going to start with 1654 because that's when the Jews came to America. But we're actually not going to focus on the Recife 23. We're going to focus on some laws that were in place when they arrived here. And we're going to sort of follow along the relationship between the Jews and the state through the colonial era and into the early republic, and see what happened when the Constitution came into play and other laws happened after 1776. And we're going to end in 1826 because that is when the last disability in state legislation finally fell, and it was my home state of Maryland. It's not really my home state, my adopted home state of Maryland.
Wouldn't it have been better to go up to 1865?
So that's a good question. The reason I stopped at 1826 is because periodization is something that historians love to engage in, because thinking about when you start a period and end a period is actually a form of historiography. It's a form of deciding what's important about a particular period, or how a period hangs together. So the reason I ended in 1826 is because I feel that by 1826, a certain set of issues were worked out. A certain set of issues with respect to Jews and the state were finished and settled. And at that point, there were other issues that came up and other things that arose and all sorts of things. But because the early set of freedom of religion and freedom to run for office and all those kinds of things were worked out by 1826, it was a good time to break that period. The period of 1865 is a fascinating period, maybe for a future course. I'm a very big fan of teaching about the Jews in the Civil War. It's an absolutely fascinating time with a ton to discuss. So maybe at some future time, but we're going to end at 1826 today because of that. You'll see why, actually. I think it'll make a lot of sense. Okay. So we're going to start in 1649, even though there really weren't Jews in America in 1649, because we're going to start with what was then, at least, a fairly progressive act. Now, the colonies each had their own sets of laws, and those laws were influenced by their parent countries, but they were also independent of each colony sort of had its own ability to make laws for itself to some extent. So this is the Maryland Act concerning religion that was passed in 1649. So you're going to see that there's the spelling and the punctuation and the capitalization is very interesting and creative in the early American period, and I've kept to their original spelling and punctuation because I think it's, I don't want to take away their words from them. So the Maryland Act says, "Be it therefore also by the law, proprietary with the advice and consent of this assembly ordained and enacted, that no person or persons whatsoever within this province professing to believe in Jesus Christ shall from henceforth be anyways troubled, molested, or discountenanced for, or in respect of his or her religion, nor in the free exercise thereof within this province or the islands thereunto belonging, nor any way compelled to the belief or exercise of any other religion against his or her consent." So that all sounds great. It sounds really progressive and awesome, except for the part I highlighted in red, which says professing to believe in Jesus Christ. So you have total freedom of religion as long as you believe in Jesus. So what is that about? What it's about is Maryland was the only colony, at least at this point, that had a Catholic minority. So whereas the other colonies only had Protestants and were only worried about freedom of religion for Protestants, this colony had this Catholic minority. There were no Jews living in Maryland in 1649, so it's not like they were worried about people who didn't believe in Jesus, but they were worried about the Catholics. So this is actually a bit of a step toward freedom of religion, because it's saying that you don't have to be Protestant. As long as you believe in Jesus, you can have freedom of religion. It's not the kind of freedom of religion we want to have. It's not the kind of freedom of religion a Muslim would want to have, but for Maryland at the time, it was fairly progressive. It sets the stage for an acceptance of difference. We're going to look at one that's a little more progressive, and that's the Charter of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, and this is from 1663, a little bit later, but not later enough that it would have been so much more progressive. It actually has more to do with what Rhode Island was about, which I'll explain in a minute. So Rhode Island's charter says that our royal will and pleasure is that no person, they all write no, N-O-E, within the said colony at any time hereafter shall be anywise molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences in opinion in matters of religion, and do not actually disturb the civil peace of our said colony, but that all and every person and persons may freely and fully have and enjoy his and their own judgments and consciences in the matter of religious concernments throughout the tract of land hereinafter mentioned. So this is a much broader statement about freedom of religion. No mention of Jesus at all. Seems to be much more progressive. So why? Why is Rhode Island so much more progressive than Maryland? So in order to understand that, you have to know a little bit about Rhode Island. Rhode Island was founded by a man named Roger Williams. Which one of you was the social studies teacher? Yes, you remember Roger Williams, I'm sure. So Roger Williams was a 17th century Puritan who lived from 1603 to 1683. And he had been a settler in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was a Puritan colony. He was expelled for being a heretic. In 1636, they said he was spreading dangerous and new ideas, which is always a problem for those kinds of religious groups. So he left and founded his own colony, because you could do that then. The land was open. So he founded a new colony in Rhode Island. And unsurprisingly, given his own personal history, he incorporated freedom of religion into the charter. From the very beginning of Rhode Island, Jews were welcome there, which was a very big change from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I'm going to tell you a little story about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and their relationship to Jews. But first I'll mention that obviously we know that this colony the Rhode Island colony was friendly to Jews because of the Touro Synagogue, which is the second oldest congregation in America. So the Puritans had a very interesting relationship to the Jews. The Puritans loved Judaism, but they didn't like Jews. They saw themselves as the new Jews. So if they were the new Jews, then they don't want the old Jews around because they're in the way. And they really took on a lot of sort of aspects of Judaism. They used Hebrew. They studied the Bible in Hebrew. They even sometimes called their ministers rabbis. They called Boston the city on the hill, the New Jerusalem. They said that they came over to America in Ararat. They landed on Ararat, and they were like Noah in the Ark. They really, really took on sort of aspects of and characteristics of Jews. But they only wanted Jews around if they were going to convert to Puritanism, because otherwise they're still there, and the Puritans can't be the new Jews. They're being faced by the fact that they're old Jews that still exist, and they didn't like that. So, example of how the Puritans treated the Jews. A classic case is the case of a man named Solomon Franco, who arrived from Holland in 1649. Now remember, we talked about the Jewish community starting in 1654, but Solomon Franco was one of these classic pre-1654 Jews who came by himself. No wife, no children, came to do some trading, and the plan was for him to leave. Except that for some reason he didn't leave. We don't know whether he missed the boat back or whether he jumped ship. We don't know. Something happened, and he ended up not going back with his boat to Holland. The court got wind of the fact that Solomon Franco, this Sephardi Jew from Holland, was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They ordered him expelled. And they said they would give him an allowance, because he had no way of making money, of 6 shillings a week for 10 weeks, and then he was out. So he had to leave within those 10 weeks. And indeed, apparently he did leave within those 10 weeks. So certainly the Massachusetts Bay Colony would not be anywhere near what we see here in terms of Rhode Island. That's sort of what we're dealing with at this time. So Rhode Island is quite progressive for the different colonies at the time. Many of the other colonies had language sort of talking about, like, you had to be a believer in Jesus in order to do anything. You had to swear your belief in Jesus. You had to take an oath. You had to do all kinds of things to sort of prove that you were the religion that they wanted you to be. Okay, so that sort of persists throughout the 1600s and into the 1700s, and in fact, in many cases, into the Declaration of Independence. But before we get to that, I have to talk a little bit about England. In 1740, the English Parliament passed a law called the Naturalization Act. It was also called the Plantation Act. And it was meant to make it easier for aliens to get citizenship in the colonies of England. Not in England itself, but in the colonies. The Brits had all kinds of rules about people engaging in commerce in their colonies, and you had a lot of trouble engaging fully in commerce unless you were a citizen. So immigrants really wanted to become citizens. It's not like they wanted to come and just conduct their business and leave. They really wanted to become citizens so they could be fully engaged in the economic process. In England, in order to naturalize as an English citizen in the mother country, typically it required you had to both profess Christian belief and you had to prove that you took sacrament in a Protestant church. Now, that's a lot easier in the colonies. The requirements are a lot easier in the colonies because Britain wants them to have commerce and trade in the colonies. They want to encourage people to engage in commerce and trade. Also, I think we talked about in earlier weeks, the colonies sort of are like, oh, we don't know what's going on there. So it's because it's so far away from Europe, they can get away with things that they can't get away with on the continent. So we know, for example, that between 1718 and 1739, 13 Jews were naturalized in New York alone under this law. And that's a lot. I mean, it sounds like ridiculous, it's nothing to us, but that's a lot for this period of time. In 1740, the British Parliament passed this law, known as the Plantation Act, the Naturalization Act, in order to sort of regularize and systematize this naturalization procedure and encourage immigrants to come to the colonies. So they're going to try to make it easier, smoother, and more comfortable for people to become citizens. So what do they provide? The first thing is that they provide a 7-year residence requirement. You have to live in the colony for 7 years. Okay. They also simplify operating procedures and reduce costs, make it a little bit easier. And then there's this piece. And they say, whereas the following words are contained in the latter part of the oath of abjuration, which is you have to swear upon the true faith of a Christian, and whereas the people professing the Jewish religion may thereby be preventing from receiving the benefit of the act, be it further enacted by the authority aforesaid, that whenever any person professing the Jewish religion shall present himself to take the said oath of abjuration in pursuance of this act, the said words upon the true faith of a Christian shall be omitted out of the said oath in administering the same to such person. Okay. So the Jews who wanted to naturalize as citizens in the American colonies did not have to swear an oath to Christianity, did not have to take sacrament, and neither one of those things were required of them. No similar exemption was given to Catholics. But apparently, we don't really know exactly what happened, but apparently both of this provision with the freedoms it gave to Jews, they were slipped in at the last minute. And it's not really clear why it happened that way. I have my theories, though. Well, of course they want Jews to be allowed in. If they're trying to increase commerce and trade, you better let in the Jews, right? The Jews are such an enormous part of Atlantic trade at this time. If you're not going to let them naturalize, you're really going to be shooting yourself in the foot. So I think that was what was going on there. It's not so many Jews in North America ended up taking advantage of the Naturalization Act because, of course, 36 years later, America becomes an independent country. But it actually ends up having a bigger impact in Jamaica, interestingly. But it does mark a step on the path toward equality because every one of these laws that sort of takes away legal disability that the Jews suffered not only takes away the legal disability, but also patterns people's brains to think in a certain way that those legal disabilities are improper in some way. However, we all know that laws can look one way on paper and actually behave quite another way in reality. And I wanted to share with you one vignette that is telling in that regard about the Naturalization Act. And it's the story of a man named Aaron Lopez and a man named Isaac Elazar, who were 2 Rhode Island Jews, and they sought naturalization under this act in 1762. There's a picture of Aaron Lopez. It's not a very good picture. You can't really see what he looks like, but he was quite a man, and his story is incredible. Aaron Lopez was born Duarte Lopez in Lisbon, Portugal in 1731. He was from a family of conversos who had lived secretly as Jews for 200 years. 200 years, imagine. He married another converso because that's what they did. Her name was Anna, and within 2 years they had a child that they named Catherine. Aaron's older brother, Jose, had left Portugal a number of years before, and he had gone to the colonies, and when he got to the colonies, he came out as a Jew and took the name Moses. Moses was naturalized in 1740, and he was granted a license to make potash, and in 1753, and he became a very upstanding citizen of Newport, Rhode Island, a very successful merchant. 1752, Duarte and his family followed Jose/Moses to the New World, and they also came out as Jews and became Aaron and married to Abigail with their daughter Sarah, which is it's extraordinary. I mean, every time I hear about these people and I think we have problems, right, in this country with assimilation and this and that. This family stayed Jewish for 200 years, and it's just unbelievably, it's so humbling. So he became very active in shipping and whaling and the manufacture of candles. And after living in Newport for 9 years, he decided that he too wanted to become naturalized as a British citizen. And he was joined at that time by this other man named Isaac Elzer. We don't really know very much about him, so I'm really going to focus more of the story on Aaron Lopez. So they go to court and they say, "We're here, naturalize us." And the court said no. Why? He lived there for 7 years. The provision said he didn't have to swear anything. They're supposed to streamline the process. He's a successful merchant. Why aren't they letting him naturalize? So they're not content to accept the rejection, and they appeal to the Rhode Island Congress, the lower house of the legislature, for redress. And the House says, okay, we're going to approve the naturalization, but you have to go back to the Superior Court and swear your allegiance to Rhode Island. And not only that, but you're not actually eligible for full freedom in the colony of Rhode Island, and you can't be elected to public office, and not only that, but you also can't vote. Really? That doesn't sound right. The Parliament said this has to go back to the court because the courts have jurisdiction over naturalization and we don't. The court goes back in 1762 in March and they hear the case. So Ezra Stiles, who was a Protestant minister at the time, very famous, and later became the president of Yale College, recorded what happened when they went back before this court. So he says, first the court pronounced the sentence of hanging on a notorious thief. Then it sentenced an arsonist to the same fate. A perjurer was then sentenced to the pillory. Finally, the Jews were called to hear their almost equally mortifying sentence and judgment, which dismissed their petition of naturalization. Whether this order of the cases was designedly or accidental in proceeding upon the business of the court, I don't learn. So he a little bit thought that they're just, putting these guys on a list of people who are getting screwed over by the court. The court reasoned that Parliament in England had allowed this naturalization process to occur in order to increase the population of the New World. But, they said, Rhode Island's already overpopulated. And because Rhode Island is overpopulated, the Naturalization Act does not apply here. So, many years ago, when I was about to teach this, I decided to look up the statistics of population to see if Rhode Island was actually, in fact, overpopulated. And here's what I found. Virginia in 1770, so a little bit after this, had 447,016 residents. Pennsylvania had 240,057. Massachusetts, 235,808. Rhode Island had 58,000. Not really overpopulated. Now, Rhode Island's really small, but okay. Delaware had 35,000. New Jersey, which is bigger than Rhode Island, but not that much bigger, had 117,000. Connecticut had 183,000. I don't think Rhode Island was really overpopulated. I think they just didn't like Jews. So, the court their final verdict is the free and quiet enjoyment of the Christian religion and a desire of propagating the same were principal views with which this colony was settled. And by a law made and passed in the year 1663, no person who does not profess the Christian religion can be admitted free to this colony. And they left it at that. They did not let them become full citizens of this colony of Rhode Island because they were Jewish. Okay. The court's verdict actually led Reverend Stiles to make a very interesting comment. He said, "I remark that Providence seems to make everything to work for mortification to the Jews and to prevent their incorporating into any nation, that thus they may continue a distinct people." So he sees God's hand in this. He says, God doesn't want them to assimilate, so therefore God's not going to let them in. It makes, it gives you pause, right? It gives you pause to think about, what happens in a society when the Jews are welcomed in, then of course, we mess it up and we assimilate. Sort of an insightful moment for him, and it's something we should remember when we go in next week to think about the people who assimilated and the torture that it put them and their families through. Okay, so at this point, Isaac Eleazar gives up his quest to become a naturalized citizen. He says, forget it. But Aaron Lopez doesn't give up. 18 days after he was rejected by Rhode Island, he decided that he was going to try in Massachusetts. Now, by this point, he was able to do that. The Puritans' control was not what it had been. And the agent that he inquired with determined that he had to produce proof that he resided honorably in Rhode Island for 7 years, and then he would just be able to spend a few months living in Massachusetts, and that would be enough to establish residency, and he could do it. Yeah.
If they didn't allow but you at that time to be a complete citizen, what things were withheld from them?
Right. So there are two things that were withheld from them. The first thing is the right to run for office, and the second thing is the right to vote.
The right
to vote. Yeah, which, are two pretty big things. The right to run for office, okay, fine.
Yeah.
But the right to vote was a big thing. And of course, the right to vote is something that's emerging at this time in the colonies and in Europe as well. It's something that's, not there yet in Europe, but except for on a local level, and will become obviously soon when the French Revolution happens. But in the colonies, there were elections held.
But there was never any talk about sending them away or making them
right.
leave.
Right. Well, there was, Solomon Franco was sent away when the Puritans were controlling Massachusetts Bay Colony. And remember that Peter Stuyvesant tried to send the 23 back away. But that was under Holland, it wasn't under England. Yeah. So generally, no. Generally, they did not try to send the Jews away. The Jews were good to have around. They were, they were traders, they were good to have around. So you had to be really sort of religiously fundamentalist in order to want them to leave. And in fact, we're going to see now that 1762, Massachusetts Bay Colony has become progressive enough that actually Lopez does become a citizen by moving over. He moves over the state line a little bit and settles there for a few months, and then he becomes a resident of Massachusetts and a citizen. And then, of course, he trots right back across the border and stays in Rhode Island, but he's a citizen now, so it's all okay. So then during the Revolutionary War, British forces captured Newport, and Lopez flees to Massachusetts, to Leicester, I think it's pronounced, and he joins other displaced people from Newport there, and he's there in hiding, whatever. So, and then the end of the war comes, and he goes back to Newport, and unfortunately he dies in a carriage accident on the way back. And Ezra Stiles said the following about him, which I just thought was very poignant, that this is the man that they denied citizenship to. Ezra Stiles said that Lopez was, quote, an amiable, benevolent, most hospitable, and very respectable gentleman, and without a single enemy, and the most universally beloved by an extensive acquaintance of any man I ever knew. It's amazing, right? It's a beautiful, beautiful eulogy he gave him, and this was the person they didn't want to be a citizen of Rhode Island. Okay. So you can see that we're really in a very mixed bag when we hit 1776. We have states that profess to have freedom of religion, like Rhode Island, but really don't. We have states that have these Puritan roots, but are allowing Jews to become citizens. We have states that are saying everyone is great and welcome as long as they believe in Jesus. But it's sort of a hodgepodge map of what's going on in America. And then America's born. And when America's born, we all know, immediately there's this emphasis on freedom and liberty. Now, of course, we all know that freedom and liberty really connected the most to white men, Christian men. But nonetheless, the lingo and the dialogue regarding liberty was very, very prevalent. So at the time, there were probably about 2,000 to 2,500 Jews living in America in 1776. And they found this emphasis on freedom most striking. Church establishments were swept away in the colonies in the wake of the Revolution. New constitutions were promulgated in nearly every state, promising citizens great religious freedom and no established church and all kinds of free practice and all kinds of things. So what was behind this freedom? It's important for us to know this because I want to think about like what impact did Jews have on freedom of religion in America. We know that later on the Jews had an enormous impact. When we get into the late 19th, early 20th, and throughout the entire 20th century, there's been a lot of work written actually about this. And there's an excellent book called Jews in Christian America by Naomi Cohen, where she charts the impact that Jews and Jewish groups had on the development of religious liberty and separation of church and state and anti-establishment that this country has. The Jews had enormous impact. So did they have the impact here? And the answer is not yet. So who's really behind it? The first group behind it is Protestant dissenters. So Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, small sects that come to the colonies to sort of escape tyranny of other bigger Christian groups in Europe. So they want to make sure that there's no one church, right? That there are a lot of acceptable Protestant sects, maybe even Catholic groups permitted in their state. So they don't want establishment of one religion. And they want church contributions to be voluntary. So they're one group that's very forceful about the new country. And the other group is, of course, Enlightenment thinkers. Now, we know that many of the founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, Paine, etc., they were deists or Unitarians, and they had embraced Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu and all those famous thinkers that you can think back in your head and remember learning. We just actually finished studying them in our 10th grade here. And they didn't actually necessarily agree that religion was a force for good the way the Protestant dissenters would have. They weren't sure if religion was a force for good or whether it really should be abandoned in favor of reason. But whatever it was, they knew it wasn't a prerequisite for good citizenship. And in the end, for the most part, it was actually the Enlightenment thinkers who won out, as we know, right? The Enlightenment thinkers shaped the way religion and state are dealt with in this country. In 1777, you will be pleased to know that New York is the first state to extend liberty of conscience to, quote, all mankind. Not women yet, but okay, regardless of religion. So that was good. They did still have one little disability. If you were born abroad, you had to come and take an anti-Catholic test oath. But if you were born in America, you were good. You had freedom of religion and liberty of conscience. So that was good. Virginia similarly had an act called the Act for Religious Freedom, which was very influential and very comprehensive, and it distinguished civil rights from religious opinions, very important. All men shall be free to process and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. You can say whatever you want, you can believe whatever you want, that's not going to change whether you're a member of our society or not. So that would have saved poor Aaron Lopez, right? Mm-hmm. He would have done a lot better. Come on in. And then comes the Constitution. So the Constitution is ratified in 1789 and the Bill of Rights in 1791. So there are two pieces of the Constitution we have to look at when we're thinking about acceptance of Jews in American society. One of them you are for sure familiar with, which is the First Amendment, and the other one you may not be as familiar with, which is Article 6. So we'll look at Article 6 first. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So if you remember, that was one of the big disabilities, was running for office or serving in any kind of public capacity. It's done. Once the Constitution is passed and ratified, that can't be in any federal capacity. You can't use the fact that somebody's a Jew to prevent them from having public office or a Catholic or any religion. They used to call Muslims Mohammedans back then. The literature is all full of, well, we don't want the Mohammedans to come in. The Jews are okay, but we don't want the Mohammedans. And then the First Amendment is ratified. And you could probably remember back when you probably studied the First Amendment, and you know that there are two clauses in the First Amendment. Just make sure I have enough time. So the First Amendment has two clauses with respect to religion. And it's the first line. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The Establishment Clause prevents the government from establishing a state church, saying that the church of the country is X, like the Anglican Church is the Church of England. We're not allowed to do that here. So that would be like, whenever I teach about this, I would say, that would be like having a prayer in Congress. Oh yeah, we have that. That would be like having a Christmas tree in the White House. Oh, we have that too. That would be, so we have a few problems with the Establishment Clause, but okay. Basically, we're pretty good with it. Prayer in public schools falls under the Establishment Clause, that kind of thing. Free exercise. Whatever religion you are, as long as you're not interfering with somebody else's life and limb, as long as there's a compelling state interest to restrict your freedoms, you can observe your religion as you see fit. So the classic case of a free exercise clause is the case of Yoder versus Wisconsin, the public school case where the Amish sued the state of Wisconsin, saying that they didn't think their children should have to go to school past the age of 14, that it was against their religion for the Amish to educate their children past the age of 14. And ultimately, the Supreme Court held that there was no compelling state interest to keep those children in school from ages 14 to 16, that Amish people were not on the dole, they were not addicted to drugs, they were not committing crimes, and for the type of work they were going to engage in, which was farming, their age 14 education was sufficient, so the state could not actually encroach on their religious liberty in that way. So that would be a free exercise thing. So this is huge for the Jews, huge. Because now, not only is there no state religion in America, which is totally not the case in a single other country, probably in the world where Jews live at this time, but they have a protection enshrined in the Constitution of the country that they can practice as they see fit. Typically, that wasn't an issue for Jews. They were usually allowed to practice as they saw fit, but certainly they could have certain legal disabilities assigned to them for being practicing Jews. So this was a huge, huge thing for them. And all this happened without the Jews really being involved. This all came to them without them being involved. And in fact, most of the debate didn't discuss them at all. It had nothing to do with them. Religious liberty documents in America have to do with, highfalutin Enlightenment ideas. They're not talking about Jews. So Jews really gained their freedom along with everybody else in America. When you study in university, when they talk about, there's always a class in graduate school about the emancipation of the Jews. How did the Jews get emancipated? And the professors always say, well, they didn't really get emancipated in America because there was nothing to emancipate. They just were. You were free from the very beginning. There wasn't a process of emancipation that went on. So when did the Jews finally start to speak out? Well, actually, it turns out very, very shortly after the country was founded. Because remember, our country is structured such that we have a federal government, but we also have state governments. And the state governments were not necessarily quite as progressive as the federal government was with respect to religion. So for example, Philadelphia was a very important Jewish community. It actually had even been the largest Jewish community in America for a short period of time during the Revolutionary War when the Jews of New York fled because of the war. They went to hide in Philadelphia. So it was quite galling to the Jews that the state's Declaration of Rights, which was enforced in 1776, mandated a religious test that acknowledged, quote, the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. Okay, so if you wanted to run for office in Pennsylvania, you had to acknowledge the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. Okay, like the Old Testament we'd be okay with, but maybe we wouldn't even be okay with that because it doesn't really leave any room for an atheist or something like that. And later on, Jews become very careful about taking all this stuff out of legislation. But certainly the New Testament is not going to work. So what happens? Mikveh Israel, which is the synagogue in Philadelphia, the only synagogue in Philadelphia at this time, sends a petition to the state, and the petition asks for redress regarding this law. Interestingly, and I didn't put the language of the petition here because there are other documents I wanted to focus on and I was afraid we would run out of time. But interestingly, the letter actually looks a whole lot like the letter in 1654 that the Amsterdam Jews wrote to the Dutch West India Company in defense of the Recife 23. First of all, it appeals for the rights of Jews as a group, which is very interesting in post-Declaration of Independence America, where we think of people as being individuals and having individual rights. Second of all, they based their case on the usefulness and patriotism of the Jews. Again, sort of a strange thing to do after America is declared as country. And thirdly, they hinted at perilous economic consequences should the Jews be denied. So again, they're like doing this little dance about the Jews are very valuable, you better not cross us, you're going to be in big trouble if you do that. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this petition actually went nowhere. It gained positive support in the press. The court sort of said that the legislative body that they sent it to said, well, we don't really have the power to change it, we can't really do anything about it, blah, 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 and it's like blah, blah, blah around for a long time. And finally, this man named Jonas Phillips, who was a leader in the Jewish community in Philadelphia, continually petitioned the state over and over and over again, and finally in 1790, the law was changed. So this was a case where the Jews actually had a very, very fundamental role in changing state law and getting rid of that sort of, you have to take an oath to the New Testament in order to have any kind of office there. And of course, we know about the very, very famous letters that the Jews wrote to George Washington and received back from George Washington. So I'm going to give you a little introduction. I actually brought copies of the letters here for you to take a look at. After George Washington became president in 1790, many people wrote him letters of congratulations. And apparently this was, I'm sure people still do that today with the presidents. Sort of the way, I don't know if you did this, but I know that my mother did it and I did it also. When my children were born, I sent birth announcements to the White House and, just to get back a little card from the president that said, congratulations on your baby, and then you put it in their baby album. I think I actually didn't do it with my fourth child, the poor thing, but my first three have them. So people wrote him letters of congratulations, like it was the custom when a king ascended the throne, you would write a letter of congratulations. The American Jewish community was very disorganized and non-centralized, as we spoke about last week. So they actually sent 3 different letters. 3 different synagogues in the community wrote letters. And which is funny because I think like the Presbyterian Church would have sent 1 letter, the Catholic Church would send 1 letter, but the Jews sent 3 because they weren't together as a one unit. All of the letters apparently were quite embarrassingly late, like significantly after he took his oath of office. The Truro Synagogue letter is the one we're going to look at. That's the most famous letter, and it was actually timed to coincide with the president's visit to Newport on August 17th, 1790. So they actually sort of made up for the fact that they were late because they were able to link it to his visit, so it was okay. So, we look back at this, before we look at the letters, I just want to make a comment that later generations, we look back at this and we say, there are 3 letters, the Jewish community was disorganized, as I was just saying, they were disunified, and we know that that is indeed the case. But I just wanted to mention that Jonathan Sarna, who is the greatest living scholar of American Jewish history, I would say, said that it actually reveals that American Jews had very determined congregationalism, meaning focus on their own individual congregation, and they were extremely reluctant to cede authority to any single congregation, even Shereth Israel, which is sort of the mothership of the American Jewish community. It just shows sort of very fierce independence that American Jews felt at this time. And I think to some extent, American Jews have always felt a sense of fierce independence. So it's an interesting way of looking at that disorganization and perhaps giving it maybe a little more positive spin on it. So here are pictures of the letters. I don't know if you've been reading. Over the past few years, there have been all kinds of scandals about these letters. Apparently, one of them has been held in private hands for a long time, and he won't give it up. And there's some scandal going on with the letters. I'm not really sure exactly what it is. But the one on the left is the letter to the president, and the one on the right is the letter from George Washington back to the community. And of course, at the bottom, there's the Truro Synagogue. So I'm going to give you the letters here. I just want to point out a couple of little things, and you can read them at your leisure, but I wanted to point out a couple of what I think are really, really interesting things about the letters. The first thing I want to point out is on the page that you have is the warden of the Truro Synagogue is Moses Satius, and he signs the letter. And he writes, "Sir, permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits," blah, blah, blah. Children of the stock of Abraham? What is that all about? So I think it's important for us to recognize what that is about. Well, Christians are also children of the stock of Abraham. So if they're reminding, he is reminding George Washington, and whoever's going to read George Washington's letter, that Jews and Christians are together, that they're partners, that they are part of the same lineage. And in fact, he goes on in the course of the letter to talk about the God of Israel in a way that is obviously also the God of the Christians, draws upon many, many biblical texts and biblical allusions, talks about the fact that God wanted George Washington and the revolutionaries to win the war, putting God, the Jewish God is on your side, and therefore you should be on our side, etc. The last thing I want to point out is the line that becomes very famous for George Washington saying to the Jews was actually first said by Moses Seixas to George Washington. And it is in the middle paragraph, the one that starts with deprived as we heretofore have been. He says, we have a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events. Behold, a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming every one of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great governmental machine. It's a great line. To bigotry, no sanction. It's become an incredibly famous line for the American Jewish community. It's on, the museum, as on the wall of the National Museum of American Jewish History, and it's, it was very, very famous. And of course, George Washington writes back a very lovely letter in response, and he's extremely positive in his letter back about what they said. And the key part where he then quotes themselves back to them is, I put up here on the slide, but is also the second to the last paragraph here. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. So just a lovely statement back to the Jewish community of his commitment and the commitment of the new government to not toleration, but a true equality. So it's actually a very beautiful thing to read and makes us feel really, really very good. The story is, of course, not over. I mean, we know that, these kinds of letters are often very, very beautiful, and then, things happen that aren't quite so beautiful. So I'm going to share with you a couple of quick stories. The first one is about a man named Mordechai Noah. So much to bigotry, no sanction. Mordechai Noah was appointed in 1813. He was 28 years old to serve as the American consul to Tunis. He had lobbied for the job. He was quite a go-getter. And he won the appointment, partially because they believed that he would be able to connect to the North African Jewish community. Remember, trade, right? So the Jews are powerful there, they're wealthy, and they're traders, and they want him to connect to them. It's kind of like, yeah.
Didn't he try to form a colony?
Yes, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Yes, he did try to. It's the wackiest story in the world, right? It's crazy. Yes, we're going to talk about that colony. So apparently there was some pushback about the fact that a Jew had been appointed as the consul of Tunis. It's a Muslim country, and there was a decision made to recall him. And you can see President James Madison, 1815, I rest the reason pretty much on the ascertained prejudice of the Turks against his religion, it having become public that he was a Jew. So they're going to take him back because he's Jewish, and the Turks are not going to be accepting him. Not so nice. And Mordechai Noah was very angry. James Monroe, who was at the time the Secretary of State, said that Mordechai Noah's religion was, quote, an obstacle to the exercise of his consular function. So Jews around the country were outraged. Mordechai Noah was outraged as well. He sent many, many letters to the White House objecting to what had happened, trying to get an answer, like what happened, like why did his religion make such a difference? Why was that justifiable given the Constitution of the United States, given the laws of the country that they should take him back just because he was Jewish? He was afraid it would set a precedent for future Jews who are taking leadership positions for the country. He thought that maybe Jews wouldn't be able to hold public office in certain places or granted offices in the federal government. He was really, really upset. He got letters from various other important people, including John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who's wrote in his favor. And Isaac Harvey, who was a prominent Jewish leader. He actually became sort of the first leader of a Reform congregation in America, in Charleston, says, Jews are by no means to be considered as a religious sect tolerated by the government. They constitute a portion of the people. They are in every respect woven in and compacted with the citizens of the Republic. It's almost George Washington's language, right? They're not supposed to be tolerated. They're part of America, which is really what George Washington was saying in his letter. And of course, Mordechai Noah himself says the religion of a citizen is not a legitimate object of official notice. Didn't matter, he didn't get his position back. He turned his attention to other things. But nonetheless, we have this instance of this person who is standing up for his rights as a Jew, doesn't win, but is unafraid to stand up for it. And certainly there was enough sort of bad will, ill will that was engendered by this that the government thought twice before doing something like that again. Just to mention what happened in his later career, he actually moved to New York. He founded a number of newspapers, the National Advocate, the New York Enquirer, the Evening Star, and the Sunday Times. And in 1825, he actually decided to found a Jewish refuge in a place called Grand Island, which is in the Niagara River, near Niagara Falls, and he was going to call it Ararat, after Mount Ararat, the biblical resting place of Noah's Ark. So he purchased land on the island. It was $4.38 an acre, and he was going to build refuge for Jews, and he brought a cornerstone. He made a whole speech, and he brought a cornerstone that said, Ararat, a city of refuge for the Jews, founded by Mordechai M. Noah in the month of Tishrei, 5586, September 1825, in the 50th year of American independence. Well, guess what? No one moved there. Not one single Jew moved there, which is, of course, the real end of the story for Mordechai Noah, right? Because why would anyone move there? Although he was discriminated against for being a Jew, in general, the Jews were doing very well. And they didn't really feel like they needed a refuge in America. They were really fine where they were. So he took his cornerstone and went packing, and that was the end of that. The cornerstone is actually on display to this day in Buffalo and the Historical Society. But many people actually look to him as being a little bit of a precursor of Zionism, that to see a piece of land as being a refuge for Jews was sort of a precursor to the idea of Zionism. Of course, 1825 is long before the Zionist movement is arising, so perhaps he's a precursor. Okay. The last story I want to share with you is the story of the Maryland Jew Bill. And it's yet another story of sort of the hanging on of these old prejudices and the efforts that Jews had to take to really shove those last bits of prejudices out of the way. So in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, of course, we know, proclaims all men are created equal. The people of Maryland adopt a constitution that says the following. No other test or qualification ought to be required on admission to any office of trust or profit than such oath of support and fidelity to the state. So far we're good. And a declaration of belief in the Christian religion. So if you are going to take office in the state of Maryland, you not only have to swear to support the state, of course, but you also have to declare belief in the Christian religion. Okay? A little bizarre. When the Federal Bill of Rights is adopted, 1791, which assures freedom of religion to all American citizens, it becomes fairly clear that that provision is unconstitutional. They can't have it. And seemed that way to Jewish leaders in Maryland, particularly two Jewish leaders named Solomon Edding and Jacob Cohen, who lived in Baltimore. That was really the main Jewish community in Maryland at the time. Maybe a couple of Jews living in Frederick, but really the main Jewish community is in Baltimore. It's still very, very small. And they appeal to the Maryland Assembly in 1797, and they say, we are a part of a sect of people called the Jews, and we are deprived of invaluable rights of citizenship. We want to be placed on the same footing as other good citizens. And indeed, they deserved that footing. Edding had fought in the American Revolution. He had been active in public life in Pennsylvania before he moved to Baltimore. He was the first American-born shochet, actually. He served as the director of the first American railroad company, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. If you ever played Monopoly, the B&O Railroad, that's the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He was a banker. He was a Jewish communal leader. And he was a Jeffersonian Democrat. He had very influential friends in the Maryland state legislature. Maryland has been a Democrat state forever. And it's like, if you don't vote Democrat, well, it doesn't matter what you vote. The state's going to go Democrat no matter what. So their petition in 1797 started a 30-year battle to get rid of that religious requirement. It's extraordinary to think that that was the case, especially when you look at the state of Maryland today, which is an enormous Jewish population and would never be able to have any sort of thing now. I mean, Maryland is probably, I would say, maybe the 5th most populous or percentage-wise Jewish state in the country. It's quite a Jewish state. 100,000 Jews in Baltimore. There are many Jews in the Washington area, etc. But nonetheless, at this time, it was a 30-year fight to overturn this. So first, they had a committee of the assembly, and they said, yes, that's very, very reasonable. And then it was tabled for years and years, which happens a lot with legislatures. They kept organizing petitions from 1798 to 1804, and all the time the Democrats supported them, and the Federalists blocked the passage of it, and et cetera. They had the rural members of the parliament who were very conservative, very anti-immigrant. They didn't want the Jews to be part of the state at all. They thought that maybe if they kept this law in force, that the Jews wouldn't live in Maryland at all, and so they kept voting against it. And then they would say, if we allow the Jews in, then who's next? Who's next is going to be the Mohammedans, the Turks, and the infidels. And so this went on for decades. And finally, by the early 1820s, they find a guy who's going to help them, a non-Jew, who sits in the Maryland legislature. His name was Thomas Kennedy. He was an Irish Catholic. And he wanted to broaden the spirit of toleration in Maryland because he was a Catholic, and he doesn't want the Protestant sort of stranglehold on the state. So he makes a plea for fairness as citizens, that Jews and even Turks and infidels have to have the same right to serve in state government as any other citizen. So Edding and Cohen say, Kennedy, this isn't going to work. Just leave the Turks and infidels out. Just say Jews. Because the Turks and infidels are so unpalatable. I mean, we're at least somewhat palatable. They're really unpalatable. If you just make the case for the Jews, they'll take out the language, and then anybody can do whatever they want. But just don't talk about them. And in fact, that's what Kennedy decides to do. He brings forth the bill to extend to the sect of people professing the Jewish religion the same rights and privileges enjoyed by Christians. And that bill became known as the Maryland Jew Bill. The conservative voters continued to oppose it. And when it came up for a vote, it was defeated. Not only was it defeated, but Kennedy lost his seat in the legislature. Finally, he was reelected, and the Democrats got a majority, and they were going to bring the bill back. And they finally adopted a bill that allowed Jews to hold office. Here's the key provision. Every citizen of this state professing the Jewish religion appointed to any office of public trust shall make and subscribe a declaration of his belief in a future state of reward and punishments in the stead of the declaration now required. Okay, so they got rid of the Christian faith thing, but there's still a religious requirement. There's still a religious oath that is required in the state of Maryland. Jews can now take office as long as they will agree to this rewards and punishments thing. But it did not take out the offending clause from the Maryland Constitution. And in fact, the clause still remains there today. Interestingly. Formally, the Maryland Constitution limits public office to Christians, but obviously they do not enforce that clause. It's unconstitutional. You can't enforce it, but it's still sitting there. It has never actually been overturned. So that was the story of the Maryland Jew Bill. It's a very complicated story where Jews fought for many, many decades to try to overturn this religious disability that they had. Okay, conclusions, then I'll leave a couple of minutes for questions if you have. So what we saw is that early statutory language was often quite exclusionary of non-Christians or even of non-Protestants. And that change begins to occur when the United States becomes a country with the advent of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And Jews, although they don't have much of a voice before independence, in the post-independence period, they gain their voice and they start setting themselves up as protectors of freedom of religion for themselves and also by proxy for other people who are of minority religious status. At this period of time, it's not such a big issue, other minority religions, but it becomes more and more of an issue as you continue on through the 19th and the 20th centuries, and the Jews remain sort of the champions of those other marginalized religious and ethnic and national groups in society. You can see that they actually end up fighting on many, many different fronts to gain that foothold in America and to sort of hold George Washington's letter up to everyone's face and say, we were promised this, and we were promised the First Amendment, and we were promised Article 6, and you need to live up to that. And we're going to not be quiet until you do live up to it. So it took them a while to sort of gain that voice, but once they gained it, they were pretty relentless about fighting for it. And that actually sets a groundwork, a sort of a base for this country to be a place that eradicates slowly religion from the public sphere. We still haven't really totally done it, and we probably never will. But we've gotten it to a point where at least it can be palatable to most minority religious groups. And that was really in very large part due to the relentless nature of the Jews continuing to fight for their rights in this early period. So, does anyone have any questions or comments or anything like that? I think I finished a whole minute early. Okay, so I'll just mention what I'm going to talk about next week. So now that we've set up what the Jewish community was like and what the government was like, next week we're going to talk very specifically about a couple of individual stories of intermarriage that occurred in this period and the way the families addressed the intermarriage or didn't address the intermarriage, and sort of the struggles that these families had emotionally, philosophically, and religiously with what was happening to their families during this period of time. And I think you'll see there's actually a lot of pain that that you can see in the source material that's still very vibrant today. So that'll be our last look at these Jews to sort of see what they do with these loose Jewish communities and this very now welcoming external government, how that impacts upon them. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Understandably, people know that Jewish people contribute to commerce, and as you said, but who were the predominant advocates of the Jewish people so early in the history?
Right, the Jews themselves.
The Jews.
So, yeah, the Jews themselves, particularly Jews in power. So in our first class, I don't think you were here the first class, so you can listen to it online if you want to, but in the first class we talked about the fact that the first Jews who came, the 23 Jews who came from Recife, Brazil, had friends in high places, which were powerful, wealthy Jews in Amsterdam, and they were the ones who advocated for them. So that was very common, that wealthy Jews who were very well connected were able to advocate for their fellow Jews.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And our next meeting is not till after break. So next week we are off, and then I think it's the week after that we're back on. But you'll get an email about it.